A warm welcome to all the attendees from India and overseas who have joined today's webinar. These webinars are brought to you by Be Singular. And before we start today's session, I would like to give you a short info on Be Singular. Be Singular is a unique learning platform that empowers the next generation to create a real and responsible impact in the world by working with the technologies of the future. We teach exponential technologies to make our next gen better place to solve global great challenges. We also have Be Singular Futures Club, Future Leaders Club, which actually is a club by invitation only, and it comprises of a community of young dreamers who wish to work together to help change the world. We run our program in a phygital mode, so physical and online, and you can always go to our website to check out on our online courses. Be Singular Social, which is organizing these webinars, is a non-profit entity that has been launched by Be Singular in collaboration with the Banyan, a leading child daycare center chain. Our objective is to invest our resources to help foster exceptional educational experiences and learnings for the families. Now, these webinar series are an example of our commitment in finding new approaches to education that help ignite the young minds, where they can get to hear extremely accomplished people who share real-life practical experiences and help to change the world with a new approach. We have lined up some exceptional speakers who have agreed to share the knowledge in a variety of topics. I have a pleasure to introduce today's speaker and my dear friend, Pascal Finette. Pascal is a founder of Be Radical and chair of entrepreneurship and open innovation at Singularity University. Pascal has previously worked at eBay, Mozilla, and Google, and has spent his career pushing the boundaries of technology and passionately believes in that it can profoundly impact for the betterment of humankind. Pascal's talk today will focus on rapid prototyping of one's ideas, where you approach any project or problem to be solved as a learning opportunity. Presenting to you all, Pascal Finette.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm truly honored, and it's an incredible pleasure to be here with you today. Let me do a couple things. First of all, let me just say that I hope you all are safe and healthy in these crazy times. And I want to acknowledge the fact that we're living truly in a wild, wild world where the rules are being rewritten what feels like every hour now. And I actually do believe that what I'm going to show you now will help you actually make sense of this world a little bit better, or at least navigate this new world better than before. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen and going to share a presentation, which you now see. And here's what we're going to do. I'm going to walk you through this presentation for the next about 30 minutes or so. If you have questions, as was said before, throw them into the question box. We will answer them towards the end of this webinar. Also, we will make sure that you will get the slides, because a lot of people always ask me for the slides. So I will send my slides as a PDF to the organizers of this beautiful and wonderful webinar. So with that being said, let's dig into this. I'm super stoked to be here with you. I've spent quite a bit of time in India over the last 2 years. It's a beautiful continent, and my heart truly goes out to you all in these crazy, probably challenging times for many of us. But I want to show you something on how you can actually do probably navigate these uncharted territories or waters better than before. And we call this rapid prototyping. Let's start here. Most people, when they talk about rapid prototyping or think about rapid prototyping, they think about something like this, namely like a 3D printer process, the idea of like prototyping a physical product using rapid manufacturing methodologies such as additive manufacturing, 3D printing, etc. This is not really what I want to talk about to you about today. This is part of rapid prototyping, but really what I want to talk about is the mindset and the methodology behind rapid prototyping. And to give you an idea where I learned this from, I have to tell you the origin story, at least my origin story of rapid prototyping. The gentleman you see here is probably one of the smartest people I know. He's a good friend of mine, and is a gentleman called Tom Chi. And Tom was part of the team which founded Google X, which is now, of course, Alphabet X, which is the moonshot factory over at Google. And Tom is, amongst many other things, is the inventor of Google Glass. And while he was at Google Glass, or working on Google Glass, he came up with this mindset idea around rapid prototyping, which I now want to share with you. So a lot of the insights we're having are coming straight out of the secret kitchen of Google X. And here's an interesting story. So this is, of course, Google Glass, and it is a somewhat controversial product in terms of its commercial viability, but you have to give Google credit for creating a product out of nothing, which nobody has ever seen before, which is very complex in its structure. And here's what happened. So this guy here was Tom's boss. This guy is, of course, Sergey Brin. Sergey, at the time, he's, of course, part of the founding team of Google, and at the time oversaw the efforts at Google X. And he went to the Google X team in its very early days and asked the Google X team a very interesting question. He said, what would it like if Google is in your brain? Now, that sounds a little weird, but it kind of makes sense, because if you think about what is Google about, Google is about finding answers. And of course, they want to find the answer and provide the answer as quickly as possible to you. So a good question for them is then, how do you do this quicker? How do you get to the point where you think a question and you get the answer? And of course, in the old days, you type this into the Google search engine and you see it on a computer screen. Then Google brought this closer to you by using a mobile phone. And then ultimately, of course, Google using voice assistant like Google Now. But if you take this to its logical extreme, then truly Google wants to be in your brain. Now, if you ask that question, the idea of going from this question to coming up with a visual interface which projects Google into your field of view, which Google Glass ultimately does, is relatively close. It's not, unheard of or crazy. And we have examples of using augmented reality devices where we insert information into your field of view, which come from the military. So fighter jets are using for decades now what they call heads-up displays. So displays which basically show the information relevant to your flight in this case, or your target inside of your field of vision. So this is relatively quick. Now here's the challenge. And this is a true story which happened at Google as it was told to me by my dear friend Tom Chi. The team gets together and says, okay, so we want to create a device which is a heads-up display which shows information about relevant questions the user has in the field of view. Now, what happens is what Tom Chi later described as what he calls a guess-a-thon. And the guess-a-thon works like this. Nobody has ever done this before, so nobody has any reference. Nobody actually knows how to do this. But people are going out and basically making, because they're all smart, they're all making some good assumptions. And I think we all found ourselves in these situations where we're sitting together and we're like on a whiteboard and everybody has a whole bunch of good ideas. And what's interesting about the guess-a-thons is, A, nobody actually really knows because nobody has any experience. B, the person who wins the guess-a-thon, the person who's most convincing, and typically the person who's got the highest rank in the files, wins the guess-a-thon. And here's a real-world example from Google Glass. When they designed Google Glass, they said, what color does the interface need to be? And if you think about computers, computers typically have a white background and typically black text. So someone said, oh, it should be, white background, black text. And then someone says like, well, that doesn't really work on a see-through device. So probably it needs to be inverse. So you take white text. And then someone else said, well, but white has a really high strain on your eye because it's a very photonically intense color. So the guessathon evolved. And then Sergey Brin, who was part of the meeting, came out and said, well, I think it should be red. And here's the argument. Red is the least photonically active color. It has the least strain on your eye, which is the reason why when you look at a submerged submarine, for example, they switch to red light. It is at least straining on your eye. Also, every interface in a science fiction movie is always red. So clearly it needs to be red. Now here's the challenge. Nobody actually knows. And what typically happens in organizations and teams and so on, you go off and then you take this word as gospel and you just build it. And then you end up with a product which might not work. So our friend Tom Chi was pretty annoyed by this and said, you know what, I'm going to change this whole paradigm. I'm going to develop a methodology where we take what is a conjecture, an assumption, and turn it into actual knowledge in the shortest amount of time with the least amount of resources, which then became the rapid prototyping mindset. And here's what he did. In the morning, they had this meeting. It's a true story. In the morning, they had this meeting. By lunchtime, Tom basically took an old netbook, a cheap laptop computer, took a Pico projector, which is a small projector device, and then went into a DIY store and bought a few parts. He bought a coat hanger, some plexiglass, and a sheet protector, and then bent this whole thing into shape so that he could project essentially what is on the screen of the netbook onto this device. In the afternoon, and just a few $100s later, he calls the other co-founder of Google, Larry, of course, and shows him a prototype. And of course, this prototype is incredibly crude and it doesn't really work, but it gives you an idea. It's like it allows you to basically put this thing around your neck and run around the office and try out what happens when you actually have information in front of you. And the two questions they could validate immediately within literally hours was, A, is it even useful to have information in front of you? The answer was yes. And B, what color does the interface need to be? Because they could just fire up PowerPoint and change the color of the interface on the fly. And here's the interesting thing. Guess which color was by far the worst color of them all? And of course, it was red, for the simple reason that red is photonically so less intense that you can't actually see it, whereas white turns out is just the right color. So the question then becomes, how can you turn something from a conjecture, from an assumption, to actual knowledge in the least amount of times with the least amount of resources? And then of course, you take your very crude prototype and you make it a little bit better, and then you make it better and better and better, and that's how you actually build products. And then today, just to address this, because a lot of people say, well, glass isn't successful. Well, glass wasn't successful as a consumer product, but it turns out that it is actually a very useful product in areas such as manufacturing or logistics. So here's the core principles behind all of this. You can truly prototype pretty much anything. So prototyping is not just confined to making physical prototypes like we know our friend Tom Chi did with Google Glass. You can prototype service interactions, and you will see this in a minute. You can prototype many other things. When you prototype, I encourage you to aim for 10 times improvements or 10x improvements, for the simple reason that when you look at something, a problem, and you force yourself to think about 10x improvements, your mind goes to a very different state and you are challenging many more assumptions than if you were to just go out and say, what does a 10% improvement look like? When you do a 10% improvement, you stay in the status quo and you never challenge a lot of the assumptions you're holding. But if you say, man, this thing needs to be 10 times as good, as fast, as cheap, as light, as whatever dimension you look at, you really force yourself to look into at this world in a very different way. Experience trumps reasoning. This goes back to what we just talked about. You have to actually do the things and not reason about them, because reasoning this is an intellectual exercise, but you really never actually know. And as we've seen with the color of the interface, experience deeply trumps reasoning. Now, when you do this, again, I mentioned this earlier, really challenge yourself to find the fastest and cheapest path. I will show you a couple examples later, but what I find when I work with teams, both startups as well as established organizations, that very often the path being chosen is still not the cheapest and the fastest. A good example is if you think about software design and the rapid prototyping in software design, often called the minimum viable product path. We're still spending, I believe, we're still spending too much time writing actual software where it would be much quicker and cheaper and faster to just draw it out on a piece of paper and put it in front of customers and see what works and not. When you do this, you want to address what is called the 4 Ps. The 4 Ps comes out of the world of marketing and product design. It's been around for 40 years, and unfortunately, it doesn't stand for Pascal, 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 Pascal. That would be very funny. It stands for product, place, price, and promotion. Product, place, price, and promotion. And you can change and rapidly prototype each one of those dimensions. And if you think about a product or a service, they all address these, what is called the 4 Ps. So think about how you can prototype around this. Now, here's the most important thing, and we get into this much deeper in just a minute, is really focus on the learning, not on the failing. And there's a whole story around this, and we'll get there. And of course, because we are nerds and we're coming from Silicon Valley, I have to give you a quote from Star Wars, from our beloved hero Yoda, try not do, or do not, there is no try. So really it's about the doing. So here is an important message around failure. Failure for me starts with this quote from Winston Churchill, who said, "Success consists of going from failure to failure without a loss of enthusiasm." And I think that's very true. By the way, I think it's true, unfortunately, in these crazy times we are now living with COVID-19. And when you come to Silicon Valley, you hear a lot about the Silicon Valley mantra. This is the Facebook campus. And we have this mantra in Silicon Valley about failing fast, failing often, and failing forward. And I'm pretty sure many, many of you have heard this before. Now, let me tell you that this is complete and utter BS for a simple reason. Nobody likes to fail, regardless how much we talk about failure being this amazing thing and like people, we should encourage them. Nobody likes to fail. Secondly, all you're learning with failure is one way on how not to do it. But if you're not focusing on something else, you're just not learning anything. And as a last point here, I have yet to find a company which is actually successful by failing. So here's my advice. I believe we're doing this whole failing thing completely and utterly wrong. My invitation is to redefine failing as your first attempt in learning. Because here's the important thing. It's really about learning, not about failing. And even in the biggest failures of all times, you will find at least a couple nuggets of actual learning. And I want to talk a little bit about the neuroscience behind learning, because there's something really interesting happening. If you put a human into an fMRI, a brain scan device, and you have them register something as a failure, what failure does, it creates a dark spot. What happens in your brain is that very close to your amygdala, the oldest part of your brain lights up when you think about failure. It creates a fear moment. It's the amygdala is the part of your brain which is responsible for fight or flight. So it comes out of the world when we roamed the savannah and there were like wild animals who tried to kill us. And this makes sense because in the old days, Let's say you roam the savannah, you find a berry, you put the berry in your mouth, and you get sick. The next time you see that berry, you don't want to eat it again. So we anchor this as a failure, as a thing which is bad for us. Now the problem is we translate this into today's world. And in today's world, when you label something as a failure, you will find yourself sitting in a meeting where someone says, I have a new idea. And someone else will say, well, we tried this before, but it didn't work. And that's exactly the same reaction. Now, here's the interesting thing. When you label something as learning, so you really look at what have I learned, your brain lights up in a very different area. It lights up in the part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part where you create creativity. So you anchor the learning in a different part of your brain, and then creativity in reality is nothing but the connection between these bright spots, right? Creativity is the connection of learnings you had and how you can bring them together. So here's a couple of ideas around learning. This is just a repetition of what we just talked about, and I think it's so important. That's the reason why I want to repeat it. Action leads to insight more often than insight leads to action. You have to do things to learn them because you can't reason about them. It just doesn't work. A couple of ideas on how you do this best. Argue from first principles. This means that you argue from it's kind of like a physics way of looking at the world. It's saying, what do we know about the world to be true, to be fundamentally true? And then you argue up from there. So you argue from the bottom up, from first principles. Secondly, you want to apply what is called, commonly called Occam's razor. Occam's razor is this idea that you take everything in your model, in your view, in your project, which is superfluous, things you don't need, and cut them out. So you argue from the bottom up, and at the same time, you remove everything which is superfluous from the top down. You de-risk your world by prototyping. We've seen this with the work of Tom Chi. I will show you a few other ideas around prototyping in just 1 second. Now here's a tricky thing. You need to avoid what is called premature optimization. Sometimes you fall into this trap that you think you actually know what is necessary, what's needed to be done, what's the right thing to do, but you're actually not there yet. So you need to be very careful to figure out when is something real and when isn't it. And then just as a last reminder, and I keep coming back to this, thinking does not equal doing. So you have to do the things and not just think about them. Here's a couple of ideas. So instead of building a mobile phone app, just draw it out on a piece of paper. And what you do is very similar to a storyboard or a comic strip. Like every basically sheet of paper is one new interaction. And what you can do with these things is you can now go to a client, a customer, and put this in front of your customer and just say, what do you think? And I've done this very successfully when I was at Mozilla, where we went from a world where it took us about 3 to 4 days to build a low fidelity software-based prototype by literally writing code, to creating 50 of these prototypes in a single day by simply just drawing them out, showing them to people, and then have people react to it. And they say, oh, I don't understand what this button means, which is fine. Then you rip up the card and you rewrite, like you really draw the card and you show them a different version. You can build physical prototypes literally out of cardboard, and you get a physical feeling for how something could look like or work. You can build actually working prototypes if that is necessary with hardware like a Raspberry Pi. That's a $30 computer, which literally every child can program. You can prototype service interactions, as shown in this example, where the team basically prototype a checkout interaction in a cantina by simply going through the motions of how would this interaction look like. And again, the whole point is do it as quickly, as fast, and as cheaply as you can possibly do. And here's a beautiful story from our friends at Intuit. Intuit is a software company in Silicon Valley. It's probably one of the best software companies I know as in how they're approaching prototyping. Intuit has a rule which is called the follow me home. And what they're doing with the follow me home is that they observe their customers. Every single person at Intuit, literally every person at Intuit, follows a customer home at least one day a year. And what this does for Intuit is they gain really deep insights into customers' behavior because they don't ask the customer, they just observe the customer. So spending time with your customer becomes incredibly powerful and incredibly important. Now, let me give you, as a kind of like a last section of this talk, let me give you a little bit of like a few more ideas around here. There's this concept around what is called rate-based learning. And rate-based learning is kind of like the mathematical proof why what I'm telling you here actually does make sense. So if you have a new project and the new project has a, let's say it has a 5% chance of success, which in the startup world is pretty good. If you repeat this test and you assume, of course, you don't do the exact same thing every single time, but you just repeat it 20 times. So you try 20 times a new thing. Pure mathematics dictates that your chance of success becomes 64%. So you're going from 5% chance of success, which is terrible, to a really good chance of success if you just repeat the experiment often enough. So there's a real power. And again, like, of course, you change parameters in your repetitions, right? I'm not saying you should repeat the same thing, but there's real power and real scientific proof and mathematical proof why what I'm telling you here does actually make sense. Now, the good news is when you put a prototype in front of your customers, a lot of people think that you need to have many customers to validate this. That is actually not true. Jacob Nielsen, who is the founder and the CEO of an institution called Nielsen Net Ratings, which is probably the best user experience company in the world, about 20 years ago already found that if you have a good sample of your customers, so you know who your customer is. Let's say, for example, you make a product which is made for young mothers, and you have access to young mothers. What he found is that you typically don't need more than 5 users to get to a high enough confidence level to know if something works or it doesn't work. So again, this points towards that we're thinking about testing and putting prototypes out there probably a little wrong, because most of us think that we need lots and lots of users, which again is not quite true. Now, the important thing is that when you put something out, you need to make sure that you also ask and measure the right thing. Here's an interesting story which comes from eBay. When I was at eBay, we had an interesting challenge where we believed that we had a challenge in our checkout process because we saw people not buying a lot of media titles, like books and DVDs and CDs way back in 2000. And Amazon was around and people bought a lot of that stuff on Amazon. So we thought it is something in our checkout process because our checkout process was optimized for auctions, of course, which is where eBay came from. So what we did is we did what is called a user study. So you basically put people in this room. There's a one-sided mirror where you sit behind the mirror and you observe the people, the test subject, going through these experiences. And what we found is we asked people and said, here's $20, go on eBay and buy a DVD, because again, we thought it was a challenge in the checkout process. And then you observe the person as they're buying the DVD and see what they're doing. And we couldn't figure out like what the problem was. Well, it turns out that a day after we've done this, and we really couldn't figure it out, a colleague of mine walks into this room and says, I think you're asking the wrong question. So he went to the person, the test subject, and said, here's $20. And now he asked the right question. He said, go online and buy a media title. So what does the person do? They take the $20, they go on Amazon and of course buy a DVD. So afterwards we asked him and we say, why didn't you go to eBay? And he looks at us and says, well, I didn't even know that you guys sell DVDs. So what the right question unveiled was that what we thought was a problem in our checkout process, in reality turns out to be a problem in our marketing. So it's important to ask the right question. This one is a truly powerful concept. I've got this straight from our friends over at Google X. They call this tackle the monkey first. And the story goes like this. This is straight from Astro Teller, the founder of Google X. He has got the following scenario. He says, if you want to have a monkey which can cite Shakespeare, and you want to put the monkey on a plinth, on a pedestal, the question becomes, what is it you build first? And the reality is that most people will build the plinth, the pedestal first, because they know how to do it. Now, the challenge with that, of course, is you have spent all the time building the plinth and the pedestal, but you still don't know if you actually can ever train a monkey to cite Shakespeare. And at Google X, they became so obsessed with this because they found that very often they waste so much time doing the things they know how to do, but which actually really don't matter that much. That with every product they're now doing, they're creating, every service they're creating, they look at the product and ask themselves, what is the hardest thing we need to prove to be true? In this case, the monkey citing Shakespeare. And then they do that thing first. Because if that thing doesn't work, if you never can train the monkey to cite Shakespeare, you never need to build the plinth because you don't have a product. This is an incredibly powerful tool. And I'm using this in my own practice where we're looking at anything we're doing, everything we're doing actually, and say, what is it? What is the hardest thing we need to be true, proven to be true? And then we're focusing on that. Here's a couple of last ideas I want to share with you from Google X. I'm not saying you should do any of those. I just want to show them to you as in, these are some ideas on how you can think about how do you actually create the right environment for all these things to work. Google has something they call kill criteria. Kill criteria means that at the beginning of a project, they define very clearly what needs to be true by when for us to move forward with the project. And the reason why they're doing this is because it prevents them from falling into this fallacy of saying, oh my God, we already invested a year's worth of time or money or resources into this. Let's keep it going. So they're basically saying, no, 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 no. If it doesn't reach the following milestones, we're going to kill the project. And it's a very powerful tool to avoid that you throw good money after the bad money. What they found is at Google is that very often when you think about the context of a company, people get promoted or get a pat on the back for being successful with their project. But that's a weird thing because what you actually want to do is you want to encourage people to take risks. And remember, failure is really, and the associated learning is really part of the overall process. So you need to remove the fear of failing by incentivizing people, by promoting people, by acknowledging people for the work they're doing, not the result they're creating, because the result might very well be that something doesn't work. If you do this quickly and fastly enough, that's fine, you learned something. Google has a thing called TGIF. It's called, the long version of that is Thank God It's Friday. And it's basically a happy hour they do every week where they share very openly across the whole company their learnings and their successes and their failures. And it creates a really beautiful way for the whole company to learn from each other. And lastly, what Google does is once a year they celebrate the Mexican festival of Dia de Muertos. Dia de Muertos is the Day of the Dead. It's a celebration of the dead in Mexico. And what Google found is that even if you encourage people to try things out and rapidly prototype, they still feel attached to the outcome. They still mourn. They're still sad if something doesn't work. So what they've created is once a year, they created a safe space for people to share and encourage and get to emotional closure around their projects. So I pause here and I stop here. The last message I have for you is it's really about doing things. It's not about talking about them or intellectualizing them. My encouragement for you is if you have an idea, figure out how do you get this idea prototyped in the shortest amount of time with the least amount of resources and just get out there and do it. Here's the good thing. I know it might not feel that way at the moment with COVID-19, but trust me, for the first time in human history, we're living in a world where people and communities, small groups of organizations, have the same innovation power as large corporations and even nation states. And that is truly incredible. We're living, again, I fully acknowledge that it doesn't feel that way. Surely it's very, very hard for us as well here over at B-Radical and in the United States at large. But we're living in a time where we can do incredible, marvelous things, particularly leveraging technology and the human ingenuity and bringing people together. So my encouragement for you is, particularly in these hard times, to go out there and just build and do things. My last point, if you want to be in contact with me, we make this super easy. If you send an empty email, just a blank email to this email address, hello@bradical.xyz, what happens is there's a little AI bot who will immediately sends you back an email with my personal contact details, my LinkedIn, and what we're doing is we're sharing on a private mailing list all our latest research and insights on a bi-weekly basis. So every 2 weeks you get an email from us with like the latest stuff we're seeing and we've researched, etc. So I invite you to just subscribe to this email list. We'd be delighted to be in touch with you. And again, like if you want to be personally in touch, you will get an email personally from with my personal email contact details, etc. So that is what I had for you in terms of my presentation. I am super curious to hear what your thoughts are, your comments, your questions. So let me stop my screen sharing now, and we will get into a bit of a conversation, hopefully.